So Sam's gone through the descriptive stuff. So what I'll talk about briefly is the monitoring, evaluation and research network. So that's our suggested way forward in terms of how we can actually look at the synergies between these different RLP projects that are running at the project level and how we can actually combine what's happening within each of these. The premise behind that is we can set up one of these networks across any one of the 4 outcomes that is being looked at within the environment. So we can set up these networks either looking at Ramsar, threatened species, TECs, or for World Heritage Sites. And these networks can address single objectives or multiple objectives within each of those particular networks. A lot of the support for setting up the network comes from the way that the RLP projects are currently distributed throughout Australia anyway. So there's good coverage at a national level, and each of the different RLP projects that's currently being funded has a number of outcomes that it's looking at. Some of the projects, as Ashley alluded to, are looking at a single primary objective. Other projects are looking at primary objectives as well as secondary objectives, and some projects look at multiple objectives across different outcomes. So some projects might be only focused around threatened species, for example, whereas other projects will look at threatened species as well as threatened ecological communities or Ramsar sites and TECs. So there's an opportunity there across the different projects to look at where there's synergies in terms of what their objectives are across the different outcomes. Obviously, the approach that we've taken in looking at the data that currently exists for each of the projects is driven by that bottom-up approach, where the data that are being fed into the MERIT system through the portal allows us to aggregate the information from each of those projects to look at where these synergies exist already. So our review of the actual RLP projects through MERIT, setting up the metadata base and the indicator libraries, looking at the interventions and the threats associated with each of those projects, allowed us to look at where there were these commonalities. So Sam's mentioned the descriptive and the mechanistic pathways, and the key about the mechanistic pathway is that this allows us to look at how we can set up some kind of distributed experimental network, where we can set up use an experimental framework and say, well, what are the questions that we're interested in asking across the RLP projects that allow us to make sure that we can meet the objectives of that particular outcome. And that's where the mechanistic pathway tests those relationships, so we can look at the cause and effect aspects as opposed to just reporting on a single species trajectory. You can look at whether implementing a certain action that's being done by an RLP partner actually has the desired outcome for a particular objective. So does our weeding impact a threatened species positively, for example? So we can address those evaluation questions in that way. So in a nutshell, what we want to find out is what is a MER network and how are we actually going to identify them. So the MER networks that we're proposing are those networks that look at commonalities across the RLP projects that are currently funded. It is not a prescriptive network that we are putting forward. We're putting forward a framework for opportunities, because as the RLP program evolves and we have either more projects funded, as Ashley said, we might identify new priorities, new species, we can have the development of new networks. So it's not a static opportunity. There could be networks in a range of different outcome areas. But essentially what we've done to identify those networks is look at those core interventions, the threats, the targets and the habitats. So as those focal areas within the RLP program, we can identify in each of those areas where there might be scope to set up a particular network. And as Ashley mentioned before, when you looked at the threatened species, we can identify a number of projects where they're looking at the same species. So there's 9 projects working on malleefowl, there's 6 projects looking at Regent honeyeater, for example. So where those projects have already identified a common focus, we can use that as the basis for identifying where these networks need to be set up. The purpose of the network is essentially to provide and establish that platform for standardization, for using those standardized protocols to inform our monitoring and evaluation. Where we have these RLP projects operating in different places, if they're adopting those standard practices, we can then aggregate those data and allow us to evaluate the questions in a really robust manner. We can look at the different ecological outcomes and the effectiveness of the different interventions. So that comes back to that cause and effect relationship. So if those RLP projects within a particular network are all implementing the same kind of interventions, so they're all managing pests, for example, and they're managing them in a similar way, are they getting the same outcomes in terms of the response? Is the habitat improving? Is the condition of the habitat changing using the same metrics? Did the trajectory of our threatened species improve in that particular landscape? So we can generate those data, compile the data looking at specific indicators, compare them to the baselines and benchmarks, and relate them back to what our key evaluation questions are for each of those different outcomes. But importantly, each of these MER networks, because it's a monitoring, evaluation, and research network, it allows us to scientifically evaluate those target priority key evaluation questions. So we can actually go into each of these MER networks and set up specific questions related to that. So we can ask those really pointy-ended questions that say, well, has weeding actually resulted in improvement in our threatened species populations? Okay, up until now we may not have been able to do that. We do weed control, but we don't really know if it's effective or not. Setting up these distributed experimental networks allow us to actually go in and use adaptive methodologies and say, right, we're going to be putting in these types of treatments, we're going to test it scientifically, have sufficient replication and control sites, and then be able to evaluate the outcomes from that. So as I said at the beginning, there's a potential to establish a number of different MER networks across the RLP platform because of the synergies that we currently see within those RLP projects. At present, it's guided by that synergy and how much of that overlap there is between the different RLP projects. And again, as I said, we've looked at the interventions, threats, and our targets. In this case, our targets that we've used are threatened species because that's where most of the RLP projects tend to have a focus. And what I'll do now is just run through some examples about where we can actually set up these kind of networks for each of those different areas. So if we look at threatened species, out of all the RLP projects, there's 10 threatened fauna that are the focus of 4 or more RLP projects. Actually gave a list of some of those particular species, and the 2 networks that we're proposing that we look at are Regent honeyeaters and Australasian bittern, for example. There's more projects, as you might remember from Ashley's slide, there's more projects for malleefowl, but our view was that malleefowl tend to be fairly well coordinated already due to other existing efforts and programs, so maybe setting up a network for one of these other 2 species with a high number of projects might be a better approach. So if we look at the Regent honeyeater more specifically, on the map on the right-hand side, if we plot the location of where the RLP projects are and overlay that with a map of Regent honeyeater sightings through the ALA data, we can see that there's relatively good congruence between where the RLP projects currently are located and where there's a lot of evidence of Regent honeyeaters actually in those spaces. By doing these kind of overlays, we can identify novel areas where we might want to put up additional projects, so we can go and identify new sites for additional RLP work, or we can just use that existing network and say, well, we can get the work kicked off by those particular projects. On the left-hand side are the 6 projects that have Regent honeyeater as the primary objective for their particular projects. And on that graph, so the projects are down on the x-axis at the bottom with their project code, and on the left-hand side, we've got threats and interventions that each of those projects would be looking at. And we can group the projects based on whether they have a common threat that they're focusing on, whether they have common interventions that they might be adopting for their particular project. And what you'll notice straight up is that while there might be 6 projects that focus on Regent honeyeaters, not all of them adopt the same interventions, not all of them are looking at the same threats, etc. So there's, even within those projects that appear to be fairly well aligned in terms of their threatened species that they're focusing on, they still require some alignment in terms of which particular type of habitat loss and intervention they're doing to mitigate the threats of habitat loss, for example. But it provides an opportunity to go and negotiate with those RLP partners ways to actually achieve a more coordinated approach to addressing a particular threat or intervention. Some potential key evaluation questions that we might ask within that threatened species network would be, for example, do our revegetation efforts actually increase Regent honeyeater populations or their occupancy of sites? So that means we're doing the intervention, we're actually replanting, or we're doing something physically on the ground. Does that actual change in what we're doing on the ground result in what we hoped it would bring about for that particular species? So that's potentially looking at a key evaluation question at a local scale, at a project level. So does revegetation at a site result in an improvement in the population at that site? We can then scale it up. So as Sam said, our framework is looking at a hierarchical nature. So what we can scale it up and say, has our habitat improvement improved the status of that particular species regionally? So there we have your multiple RLP projects, your 6 projects that are looking at region honeyeaters. They're all doing revegetation efforts. What proportion of those populations or those projects resulted in an increase in that population? So you can report on the status of the region honeyeater at a regional level. Moving on then to looking at a network around intervention. So what we focused on with many of the projects, we're looking at a range of interventions that those projects are looking at. So on the left-hand side, we've got the number of projects that are looking at any particular intervention, and you'll see as you go through on the x-axis, we've got aspects such as weed control, pest control, habitat improvements. So the scale has shifted slightly. So I think the third one there should be habitat improvements and revegetation, which is where the red bar should be. So it's just shifted a bit. But essentially what we're looking at is that each of these different interventions, there's a lot of projects that are working on a whole range of similar interventions. More so than what you might find for threatened species. Okay, so we've got 90 projects looking at weed control, 72 projects looking at habitat improvement, for example. So the scope here to set up these MER networks is actually quite broad because there's a lot of people that are working in that space. So we can just, the networks that we have in these intervention spaces, explore the types of control that people are doing and the type of target that is responding to those interventions. Importantly though, setting up these networks for interventions depends on what's happening at each of the RLP projects, where those projects are located, because that's going to inform how they're included in the final network. The interventions require replication and also replication of the treatment. So whether it might be weeding through manual control, weeding through chemical measures, weeding through the use of fire, for example, and then control sites. So we need to have replicated treatment options and replicated control sites within our MER network to be able to answer those questions in a scientific manner. And then we can have multiple networks. So you could have one network that looks at planting efforts, one network that looks at weed control, one network that looks at fencing. But at a higher level, you'll be able to assess all of those particular networks under a revegetation banner to say, well, does fencing work best? Does revegetation work best? Does weed control work best in assessing the outcome for that particular ecological habitat? The next one that we want to look at is looking at a threat factor. So we've incorporated fire here as a threat, not because of the recent impacts of the bushfires, that's partly responsible for it, but also because fire is actually one of the threats that many of the RLP projects are currently exploring anyway. So, and again, that hasn't come across that well onto the slide, but the number of fire projects or where projects is currently looking at fire is quite high. So we have 52 projects that are already looking at the impacts of fire. Whether that fire is bushfire related or whether they're using fire as a management intervention. So some of the RLP projects are actually applying fire on the landscape to assess what the species response might be, what the habitat response might be. So there's an opportunity there to leverage from those projects that may already have baselines about how their system responds to fire to establish networks in that particular sense. We also have a fairly well-distributed network of where those RLP sites are for the fire network that we are suggesting. So again, those are all the different fire projects or where fire is listed as a threat or intervention in those projects, and they identified there by the different outcomes. So again, a good spread for that particular fire network. And again, the fire network would allow us to explore those specific questions. So does the use of fire result in a desired improvement, or does it have a negative impact that we can then evaluate against that particular aspect? So the key questions that we might be looking at there: what are the responses of our threatened species, our threatened communities to unplanned bushfires, for example? Or have those interventions that we implement through those RLP actions minimize the impacts of unplanned bushfires? So for example, if we remove weeds, does our weed control reduce the impact of bushfires throughout the landscape for the habitats as well as the species in question? So that essentially covers the MER networks, but a lot of what's happening within those networks relies on the platform that we're going to be putting in place. So each of these RLP networks would be needing to put up their data to collect their data, put it through online so that each of the RLP networks can actually analyze and interpret that information. So that relies on the platform, so I'll hand over to Sarah.